Hi guys, so today I want to talk to you about something kind of silly, but people have been asking and partially joking about it for a long time. I figured it needed to address the possibility of an Armada 2nd Edition. Before I get too far into this, I want to start out by a huge disclaimer. There is no Armada 2nd Edition. I don't think it's likely that we're going to see an Armada 2nd Edition anytime soon. I don't think this is happening at all. But because there's been so much speculation, it's hard to weed out what is meant sarcastically and what is meant seriously, or what's genuine concern versus what's just nonsense. I figured I'd just talk about it anyway, because it's something that we can talk about. I'm such a big fan of the game, I can talk about, well, what would I do better? So I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of what if I was tasked with making Armada 2nd Edition. So I'll talk about some things that I would do differently, because for the most part, the game is really, really well done. And so there's not much that really needs to change. I wouldn't change a whole lot with Armada 2nd Edition. But there are a few things that I would change. So I figured I'll talk about those. First thing, I'd make it cheaper to get into it. And by doing the one easy way to do that is just have a cheaper starter. Rune Wars did this really well with their little core essentials pack, and it basically has everything you need to get started with the game, minus any ships. So I would have one of those for a 2nd edition of Armada. It would have your dice, your damage deck, your rules, all of the stuff you need to play, minus the stuff that comes in ships. So this way you can build whatever you want to build with a fleet you want to build a la carte without having to be stuck with a Victory and 2 other Rebel ships. Maybe you're only playing Imperials and you don't want these 2 other Rebel ships that you had to pay for. So I would do that. That's, I think, one of the biggest barriers to entry. One of the problems I see most of the time is people that don't play Armada or are reluctant to get into it. It's like you got a $100 core set. It's the most expensive core set out there out of all their Star Wars games. I mean, even Legion is, I think, only $89. So, like, Legion's got a cheaper core set and comes with way more stuff. You've got 2, 3, 4 units per side, 8 units total, and Armada comes with only 3, and it costs more. So that's the biggest thing I would do. Next thing I would do is I would increase the point limit for standard sanctioned games. If we're changing points all around like X-Wing is, then that would change. But the idea is if we're going with the same points, I would up those to probably about 500 points, with the whole idea of, like, there's multiple point levels of which you can play. And granted, there is, and maybe we'd have multiple point level sanctioned events. Maybe there'd be 500 point tournaments. Maybe there'd be 300 point tournaments. Maybe there'd be 800 point tournaments. And maybe we'd have different, round schedules. Like if you're doing an 800 point tournament event, maybe that would be a special event where you only play 1 game. Or maybe 2 games or something like that, but under timed rounds. And the format would be different. But it would be a lot of community feedback on what people wanted, and that would limit where the testing went. But I know enough people that have interest in 800-point games, but they don't want to be playing, for a whole weekend-long tournament. So maybe you just do a 1-round event, and it's and it's not necessarily for like amazing prizes. Maybe everybody gets a prize, and the winner gets a little something smaller. But I would have a higher point limit so that you can get more stuff on the table. That's one of the bigger problems I have with the official format for Armada, is it doesn't feel like you're flying an Armada. It feels like you're flying a flotilla. They tried to address that when they increased the points from 300 to 400, but that just didn't do it, because then the huge ships came out, the large ships came out, which you still had, you could still only have 3 ships on the board, and it was the same problem we had when the game launched and there was only a 300 point limit. So I would increase the point limit to facilitate a wider variety of larger fleets. I mean, we're running a 6x3, giant play table. Let's fill it up. Not completely fill it up, but let's make more use of it. Another thing I would do is I would definitely look into more factions. I would look into possibly 6 factions at least, with the possibility of adding more. Although we wouldn't start with 6, we'd start with 4. And I would start with the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War time frame. We'd have 4 factions at launch, and well, maybe only 2 at launch, but 4 factions announced at launch. And they wouldn't all have to be super deep. Like, you wouldn't have to get 12 Imperial ships within the first 2 years. Maybe you're only going to have 1 ship waves. And that's fine. But you're going to, with all the factions that you have, you're going to have still a lot of content. And if I'm doing this, I would do this in the same way that they're doing other games, in that not force anybody to buy something they don't want to buy. An expansion comes out, you know, like Wave 3 comes out with one ship for every faction, same exact upgrades come in every single ship. Okay, so you're not forced, unless of course there's a ship that can only take upgrades, like the Interdictor, for example, has got its own special stuff. Well, that's obviously you know, a Rebel version isn't going to come with that. If a Rebel version that can take that comes out, it gets everything. So I would make sure I didn't force people to buy across the aisle. I think there's enough people that would want to have everything anyway that you'd still make your money. But that's me. And then eventually, once Resistance comes out, maybe by episode 9, then we would add Resistance and First Order as well, and give people those options. This would also allow us to do like all kinds of interesting tournament scenes that could be like, you know, bad guys only, like, you know, CIS, Empire, and First Order, you know, or... And then we could also potentially explore ways of like teamwork, like, okay, you know, this is a 2 versus 2, you have to be of 2 different factions, you know, or things like that. So that's, you know, there's all kinds of different things that multiple factions could add into the game, and if it continues to be a success, we can always look at adding, you know, different scum bait, like a Black Sun faction or some things like that. Are potential. If we are doing all those different factions, though, I don't want to do a scum faction specifically. What I would do for that is I would have scum be cheaper, but every faction, as part of their faction's core rulebook, has a different point boost that they have to add to hire scum. So certain factions are less likely to hire bounty hunters than other factions. So like the Rebels might have to pay like twice as much to hire Boba Fett. Whereas the Empire, you know, only has to pay like 1 more point than what he costs. Whereas maybe the First Order has to pay like 3 more because they're a little more, they think more highly of themselves. Whereas Grievous has no problem. Maybe Grievous gets to hire, or the CIS gets to hire them at cost. You know, for example. So that's kind of what I would do with bounty hunters. Possibility, you know, open to negotiation. Another thing that I would change if we were doing a 2nd edition of Armada is I would go ahead and do smaller models. And I know that this is contrary to a lot of the things that I've said, because I've always kind of been a fan of big models. Well, the problem is, I think you need to, if you're designing a 2nd edition of a game, one of the first things I would do is, any game I was going to design, with miniatures, I'd say, what's the biggest model, theoretically, we would ever someday want to do? Think about that from terms of packaging, manufacturing, painting, price point, demand. What's the biggest we would ever want to go? In Armada, maybe that's the Eclipse, or, you know, because the Executor is not necessarily the biggest ship. It's the biggest cannon, or it's the biggest, like, really recognizable ship. The Eclipse is canon. It's just we don't know exactly what the new canon version looks like right now. But I would say, all right, so maybe the Eclipse is like 10% larger than the Executor, whatever. That's as big as we would ever want to go. So how big could we possibly fit this on the tabletop and then scale everything down? We can still do a sliding scale, but instead of your ISD being like this big, maybe your ISD only needs to be about that big. Might make it easier to fit Superstar Destroyers on the board. You're still going to have a sliding scale, so it's not going to be a 1-to-1 match, but it'll be closer. This does mean a little bit of a problem for things like CR90s, which will have to be a little bit smaller. You have smaller models for CR90s in games like Rebellion. So you already have smaller CR90s. GR75s, okay, your flotilla model, instead of having 2 on there, you'd have 3 on there, and they'd still be small. You know, there's ways to make that work. It's a sliding scale anyway. But yeah, things across the board would have to scale down a little bit. Another thing with that is you're not going to like this, I'd get rid of Squadrons. Not completely. I had to start with that headline, I'd get rid of Squadrons. I wouldn't get rid of Squadrons completely, I would get rid of Squadrons as miniatures. I would represent Squadrons as, like, from a battlefield perspective, I would like to see, you know, just the capital ships. Like, the Squadrons are supposed to be so small from a distance, from a commander's perspective, maybe you can't see them. So what I would do is I would either represent them as tokens on the ground, on the battlefield, or just represent them as dice. Here's what, basically my plan for Squadrons would be something along the lines of, each squadron, like when you're traveling, like TIE fighters don't have hyperdrives, right? They have a home ship, all right? My home ship is the Warlord. So when we're done shooting, I'm gonna fly back to the Warlord, because that's where my bunk is, right? So I shouldn't be able to deploy that TIE fighter, you know, in front of my Demolisher or something like that. because he didn't come out of hyperspace. He has to launch from the Warlord. I'd also eliminate cards like Rapid Launch Base. While it's a great card, that would be like part of the natural function. So I would have TIE Fighters or Squadrons would be an upgrade that only ships that have docking capability would have. So you know, only a ship that's a carrier would actually be able, you'd actually be able to play a Squadron upgrade on. And what that means is you can launch those Squadrons, and maybe and a squadron, they would have a different color dice. So I'm thinking green dice for Squadrons. Squadrons would use their own dice. They're attacking, I think every ship would have some type of counter mechanic. So when you're attacking, they, you know, you're going to have a hit point counter on your Squadron card. It represents, all right, well, my ties are down to 50%, you know, so I only roll, like, you know, maybe for every health they have, you roll that many Squadron dice, something like that, how many green dice. Additionally, they'd have multiple purposes. So you could use them for attack. You could also use them to defend against other Squadron dice. So there would basically be some kind of system where the Squadrons escort your own ship. Right. One of the problems also with Armadas, you can just send Squadrons out all the way out, and like especially rogues too. You can send them out all the way out, no problem. And that's kind of unrealistic, right? Especially if, I mean, it depends on how you want to look at it. But like if we're taking canon and like Last Jedi, for example, as canon, Squadrons have to be very, very close to a ship, otherwise they have to turn back, right? So if that's the way it is now, well, that would work better in this game because they would be assigned to a specific ship, so they can only go out to like maybe only range 2, you know, or you keep the same maneuver template. Maybe Squadrons can only attack as far as range 3 away from a ship, and maybe different Squadrons have different range. So maybe like Interceptors can attack at range 5 away from their home ship. Maybe Bombers can only attack at range 2 from their home ship, etc. You know, something like that. But I would use them as an upgrade, and they would basically, and you could probably add more than one. Like a Star Destroyer would be able to take 3 Squadron upgrades. You know, a Gozanti might be able to take only 1 or maybe 2 Squadron upgrades, and you know, like things like that. And so I would treat them as kind of as their own upgrade with their own hit point counters that are off the board. And the thing isn't that I hate Squadrons. My biggest problem with the way Squadrons work in Armadas, if you go like 2 Squadron heavy builds, it clutters up the map so much, it doesn't really look good. I don't think it looks as good, and I would much rather see the capital ships shooting. They're like, oh, you're getting in range, you're getting too close, his Squadrons are going to be able to hit you now, as we're really far apart. You know, same thing with aircraft carriers and stuff. You know, you can't just have those planes fly across the sea on their own. You know, they need to be able to, they can only go out so far, then they have to turn around and refuel or whatever. They have to have a certain, you know, within a certain distance from their home. So I think by just using a special color of Squadron dice and representing them as upgrade cards, then they're restricted to a certain range from their home ship. Then you could do it that way. I might even put an upgrade that allows you to switch. Like, for example, let's say this ISD gets destroyed. Well, maybe not all the TIE Fighters were on him, so there's a possibility that they can transfer to a nearby ship. If, you know, maybe if you have a certain upgrade in play, or maybe if you agree to take, you know, 2 wounds, like some of them get just blown up in the shrapnel, but the ones that survive can find a new home. Maybe something like that. You know, there's a lot of kinks and stuff, but the key of that is I would look to clean up the battlefield a little bit. That would change a lot of the gameplay as far as, like, you know, your deployment advantage. You wouldn't be able to just throw a bunch of Z95s in there and be like, ha, I'm going to have a huge deployment advantage over you because I spent 50 points on garbage, you know. And that's a little bit cheesy too. So I think maybe that's something that could possibly be cleaned up a little bit. But we'll see. But at the same time, the Rebels have ships that have their own hyperdrives, so maybe that's a special type of. Maybe we do a special type of Squadron. But either way, I'd rather them be represented by something flat on the ground that we're not constantly bumping into. And you know, again, it's not the best system, but I'm thinking of, you know, if we're scaling down the size of the miniatures, I think that's something we're gonna have to do. But that's just some of my thoughts if they were to do a 2nd edition for Armada. Again, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen for a long time. But maybe someday, and I'd be okay with that. As long as there were some genuine improvements made to the game, I'd still be on board. Because I really like the game system. the way it is. Thank you guys so much for watching. I want to remind you there's another round of the giveaway going on right now, so if you would like to enter to win a $20 Cool Stuff gift card, all you have to do is become a subscriber and leave a comment on this or one of my videos. It's as simple as that. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Don't forget to check out Crabbok.com for all the latest and greatest, and I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.